Usually when you walk into a high-stakes scenario, like a courtroom or a job interview or even just a performance review, you bring your resume, right?
Oh, absolutely. You bring the hard evidence.
Yeah, you bring proof of your good behavior, your achievements, the undeniable proof that you deserve a seat at the table. It's a very specific transaction. You think, I did the work, so I get the reward.
Right. It's logical. It's binary.
Exactly. And honestly, it's sort of the fundamental mechanism by which the entire world operates. We are conditioned from childhood to understand that merit equals value.
Well, yeah, because it gives us a measurable sense of control, you know? We find comfort in the idea of earning our keep because it makes the universe feel predictable. Input good behavior, output a good result.
But then you step into the world of biblical theology, specifically looking at how ancient texts describe human beings being made right with the divine. And suddenly, that entire predictable system is, well, it's flipped completely upside down.
The resume is just thrown entirely out the window.
Yeah, it really is. And given that we are diving into deeply spiritual and foundational texts today, the sources actually inspired a thought for the start of our mission here. Before we unpack the history and all the arguments, we want to offer a divine blessing for your day on the week ahead, wishing you peace, clarity, and deep spiritual insight in whatever you are doing right now as you listen to this.
That's a really great way to start, yeah.
Thank you. So for today's deep dive, we're going to be unpacking an incredibly foundational debate in history. We're looking at Romans chapter 4, verses 1 through 25.
And we are utilizing a stack of really detailed biblical commentaries to help us do this. So just for context, the Apostle Paul wrote this text, and he is attempting to prove a highly controversial point for his first century audience.
And what's that main point he's trying to make?
He's arguing that salvation, or being made right with God, is entirely a gift of grace received by faith alone. According to Paul, it is not a wage you earn. It's not a trophy for human merit.
Right.
And it is most certainly not a reward for a flawless moral resume.
Which is a huge paradigm shift. But before we go too far down the rabbit hole of Paul's argument, we really need to define a term that the commentaries use constantly here. The word is justification.
Right, justification.
Yeah, because it sounds incredibly heavy, almost like a sterile legal term. In layman's terms, when the text talks about someone being justified, what are the actual stakes of that word?
Well, the commentators point out that justification is, in fact, a legal term. In Paul's framework, to be justified doesn't just mean you are forgiven, or that someone is, turning a blind eye to your faults.
Okay, so it's more than just a pardon.
Way more. It means the highest court in the universe has officially declared you to be perfectly righteous. You are granted a status of absolute moral perfection in the eyes of God.
Wow. Free from any liability or punishment, basically.
Exactly. And the debate in Romans 4 is entirely about how a flawed human being could possibly attain that flawless status.
So if Paul is going to convince a first-century Jewish audience that this flawless status comes without actually earning it, he has a monumental task ahead of him. He can't just invent a brand new theology out of thin air, right?
No, they would reject it immediately.
Yeah, so he has to anchor this radical idea in something his audience already reveres. He brings the ultimate witness to the stand, which is why he brings in Abraham.
Right. Abraham is the undisputed patriarch. And to understand Paul's strategy here, we have to look at the prevailing rabbinic teaching of the day.
Okay, let's unpack this. What were the rabbis teaching back then?
So, the religious elite in the first century taught that Abraham was chosen by God precisely because of his perfect obedience. They pointed to his life, citing texts like Genesis 22.
Is that the story with Isaac?
Yeah, where Abraham is willing to sacrifice his son Isaac. And also Genesis 26, where God explicitly says Abraham obeyed his commands.
So they saw him as the ultimate self-made righteous man.
Exactly. The historical consensus was that Abraham kept the law even before the law of Moses was officially given.
Okay, but let's look at the timeline, though, because Paul spots a massive chronological flaw in that rabbinic argument. He takes those exact same scriptures the religious leaders love to quote and turns them totally upside down.
He really does.
He points out that the famous stories of Abraham's spectacular obedience, like the near sacrifice of Isaac, happened long after Abraham was already declared justified.
Right. Paul directs his readers back to Genesis 15, verse 6. This is a crucial pivot point in his whole argument.
Because that verse happens years earlier, right?
Yes. That verse simply says, Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. This happens years before the ultimate tests of his obedience. So Paul's argument hinges on the sequencing.
He's telling his audience to look closely at their own sacred text. Abraham did not perform a monumental work to earn his status. He simply believed the promise.
Exactly.
And I was looking at the commentaries from John Murray and John Stott, and they spent a lot of time on the specific Greek vocabulary Paul uses here. The terminology is intensely commercial.
It is, yeah. The word translated as impute or credit is a strict accounting term.
Right. So Paul argues that if justification is based on your works, then your salvation is fundamentally a wage. If you approach God with a perfect resume of good deeds, aren't you essentially making God your employer who owes you a paycheck?
That's exactly it. When you work a job, your employer doesn't hand you a paycheck at the end of the week and call it a gift of grace.
Right. I'd be insulted if they did.
Right, because they owe you that money. It is a debt. So Paul argues that if you approach God with a resume of good deeds, you are attempting to put God in your debt. You are demanding payment as an equal.
But if justification is a gift given to someone who did not work for it, then the dynamic completely shifts.
Totally shifts. If you earn it, the glory goes to the worker. But if it's a gift, the glory goes entirely to the giver of the gift.
Okay, but testing this theory on the ultimate moral hero of the faith is one thing. Abraham is the founder. He's the good guy.
Right, he's the gold standard.
Yeah. But what happens to this accounting system when a person's ledger is massively in the red? It is easy to say grace applies to a generally good person who just believed a promise. But if this system is going to hold any real water, it has to survive a stress test on a spectacular failure.
And Paul anticipates that exact challenge. He moves from the patriarch to the king. He brings King David into the argument, quoting heavily from Psalm 32.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because David's biography is shocking, especially when you compare him to, like, the sanitized version of a biblical hero.
Oh, yeah. It's incredibly dark.
This is the man who abused his power to commit adultery with Bathsheba, actively plotted the military murder of her husband Uriah to cover up his crime, and then lived in that hidden, unrepentant state for a significant amount of time.
Right. So if the universe operates on a system of wages and works, David's wages for those actions are immediate condemnation. Under a strict labor contract with the divine, David's ledger demands destruction.
Yet, Paul quotes David's own writings in Psalm 32.
Yeah, where David writes about the profound blessedness of the person to whom God credits righteousness apart from works. He talks about his transgressions being forgiven, his terrible sins being covered, and the Lord choosing not to count his sin against him.
Okay, wait, I have to step in here. If we look at this through the lens of human justice, that sounds like a legal loophole.
It does sound like that, yeah.
Because if a human judge looks at a guilty murderer with a mountain of evidence against them and simply says, I choose not to count this against you, you are free to go, we would demand the judge be removed from the bench.
Oh, absolutely.
We would call it an absolute miscarriage of justice. So how does a perfectly holy God just wave away David's murder without violating the very concept of justice?
Well, the theologian Charles Hodge provides a fascinating breakdown of this dilemma. He explains that Paul is not suggesting God simply ignores sin or sweeps it under the cosmic rug.
Okay, so what is happening then?
Hodge introduces the concept of the double credit, or the double ledger. Justification is a twofold accounting action that maintains justice while offering grace.
Walk us through the two sides of that ledger.
Okay, so the first action on the ledger is the removal of the debt. God chooses not to impute our moral failures against us. The debt of sin is dealt with.
Right.
But simply clearing a debt doesn't make you wealthy, right? It just brings your balance to zero.
Yeah, a zero balance means you are not guilty, but it doesn't mean you are actively righteous.
Exactly. So the second action on the ledger is that God credits the individual with a perfect righteousness they did not lift a finger to earn.
It's the equivalent of waking up to find your $1 million mortgage has been completely erased. And then you check your bank account and find $1 billion deposited that you never worked for.
That is a perfect way to describe it. Martin Luther, the 16th century theologian, coined a famous phrase for this exact mechanism. He called it an alien righteousness.
Alien righteousness, wow.
Yeah, it's a righteousness that is entirely foreign to us. It does not grow in human soil. It originates outside of us, comes down from heaven, and is legally credited to our account. We possess it, but we did not produce it.
Alien righteousness. It perfectly described how foreign this entire concept is to human nature. We desperately want to produce our own worth.
We do.
And that brings us to the next massive defense mechanism Paul's audience would have raised. If salvation isn't about moral perfection, what about the strict religious markers?
Yes.
Because the audience Paul is writing to, built their entire identity around religious rituals,
Mm-hmm.
specifically circumcision and the law of Moses.
Mm-hmm.
They would argue that even if you don't have a perfect moral resume, you still need the religious initiation rites.
Absolutely. The religious elite of the time viewed circumcision as the absolute dividing line between who was in and who was out. They taught that circumcision was the very cause of Abraham's special status.
But Paul uses undeniable math to trap them here. He opens up the book of Genesis and basically looks at the timestamps.
The timeline is everything here.
Yeah. Abraham was officially declared righteous and justified in Genesis chapter 15. But he didn't receive the ritual of circumcision until Genesis chapter 17. Depending on how you calculate the timeline in the text, that is a gap of over a decade.
Right. Furthermore, Paul points out that the law of Moses, the intricate system of religious rules they are fiercely defending as the mechanism for salvation, was not given to the Israelites until 430 years after Abraham was justified.
So Paul's logic is bulletproof. How can a religious ritual or a set of laws be the cause of a man's salvation if that man was saved centuries before the law existed and years before the ritual was even performed?
Exactly. It makes no sense chronologically.
The commentator William Hendrickson offers a really helpful analogy in the sources that clarifies the relationship between the ritual and the reality. He says to think about a wedding ring.
I love this analogy.
Right. A wedding ring does not magically create a marriage. If you put a wedding ring on a total stranger, you aren't suddenly married to them. The ring merely proclaims and authenticates a commitment that has already been established. The reality precedes the symbol. Or like how a rainbow didn't save humanity from the flood, it was just a sign of the promise.
Yes. And Paul uses similar language, referring to circumcision as a seal. A seal on an ancient document authenticates the contents, but the seal itself did not write the document.
Yeah.
The ritual was meant to confirm a righteousness that Abraham had already received solely by faith while he was still uncircumcised. Charles Hodge notes that elevating a sign to the status of a savior is a miserable substitute for the reality it points to.
There is also a major linguistic dive the sources take regarding the nature of God's promise to Abraham here.
Yeah, the Greek vocabulary Paul selects is highly intentional. When describing the promise given to Abraham, Paul uses the Greek word epigelia.
Epigelia. Okay.
Right. In the ancient world, there was another common word for promise, hyposkesis, which functioned as a conditional agreement. It meant, if you meet these specific conditions, I will fulfill my end of the bargain.
Like a standard two-way contract.
Exactly. But epigelia refers to an unconditional promise that flows entirely from the spontaneous goodness of the giver. It has absolutely no strings attached.
So Paul uses that specific word to show that the promise given to Abraham is fundamentally incompatible with the demands of the law of Moses.
Completely incompatible, yeah.
Because the law is a massive conditional contract. It demands perfect obedience, and when humans inevitably fail to meet those conditions, the law only brings wrath. It takes our internal flaws and transforms them into formal, legally actionable transgressions. The promise, the epigelia, requires nothing but empty hands to receive it.
Empty hands, exactly.
But that forces us to define what those empty hands actually look like. If this status isn't achieved by moral works, and it isn't achieved by religious rituals or strict law-keeping, then what exactly is this faith? Because, in modern culture, the word faith has been watered down to mean a vague sense of blind optimism. People say just have faith, as if having a positive attitude is enough to magically alter reality.
And Paul is very careful to distinguish biblical faith from blind optimism. The faith of Abraham was intensely focused on a very specific object, the character and the capability of God.
It wasn't about how hard he believed.
No, it was about the reliability of who he was believing in. Abraham was trusting a God who, according to the text, brings life from the dead and calls things into existence out of nothing.
The biological reality of Abraham and his wife Sarah really makes this point stark. The sources highlight that Abraham was nearly 100 years old and Sarah's womb had been barren her entire life.
Biologically speaking, they were dead regarding their ability to produce an heir.
The mathematical odds of them having a child were not low, they were 0. So Abraham wasn't just being optimistic about a difficult medical diagnosis, he was believing against all human logic and natural law.
Right. And for faith to operate the way Paul describes, the absolute impossibility of the situation is the entire point. If Abraham could have achieved the promise through his own strength, or even medical intervention, he would have had grounds to boast. But the sheer impossibility leaves God to be entirely God.
Okay, but wait, I have to ask this because I'm sure someone listening right now is familiar with other parts of the New Testament and they are probably screaming at their speakers. Doesn't James say explicitly that faith without works is dead?
Yes, he does.
How does that statement square with Paul's relentless argument that human works have absolutely nothing to do with justification? Are two different biblical authors caught in a massive theological contradiction here?
It is one of the most famous tensions in biblical study. But when the commentators break down the respective contexts of Paul and James, the contradiction just dissolves. They are examining the exact same phenomenon from two entirely different vantage points.
How so?
Well, Paul is focused exclusively on the cause of salvation. He is arguing against people who believe they can buy their way into heaven with a resume. Paul insists the root cause is faith alone.
So if Paul is examining the root system hidden underground, James is looking at the branches.
Precisely. James is focused on the result of salvation. He is arguing against a different group of people, those who claim to have faith but live completely unchanged, immoral lives.
Right.
James argues that if you genuinely possess this radical, life-altering alien righteousness, it will inevitably change how you operate in the world. Saved people naturally produce good works as a byproduct of their new status. If a person's life produces zero fruit, it proves the root system of faith was never actually planted in the first place.
That makes so much sense. True faith leaves God to be entirely God. The faith that justifies is never alone. It always brings a change of life with it. But the works themselves are the evidence of the transaction, not the currency that paid for it.
Exactly. The currency is faith. And Paul notes that this true faith rests on two massive, unshakable pillars.
Which
A first pillar is God's power. The belief that he is literally capable of doing the impossible, whether that is creating a universe out of nothing or bringing a child from a dead womb.
And the second?
God's faithfulness. The belief that when he makes an unconditional promise, an epigelia, he will never break it. Abraham did not ignore the physical reality of his old age. He stared right at it, but he determined that the credibility of God was greater than the limitations of biology.
Man, we've spent a lot of time dissecting a 4,000-year-old story about a Middle Eastern patriarch and the theological debates of the first century. But how does Romans chapter 4 build a bridge across the centuries to the person listening right now?
Right. How does it apply today?
Yeah, so what does this all mean for you? What is the practical application of this ancient accounting system?
Well, Paul explicitly builds that bridge at the end of the chapter. He states that the text, the story of Abraham's justification, was not recorded for Abraham's sake alone. It was written for our instruction.
He calls Abraham the father of us all, right?
Exactly, meaning anyone who shares his type of faith. The core takeaway is that the exact same mechanism God used to justify a man 4 millennia ago is the exact same mechanism used for a believer today.
Which is radical. It completely shatters the common misconception that the Old Testament God operated on a system of strict wrath and rules, while the New Testament introduced a system of grace. Paul is proving that grace was the original, unbroken blueprint from the very beginning.
Yes. The blueprint of grace remains unchanged. But our historical vantage point is different than Abraham's. Abraham's faith was required to look forward to a promise.
Because he was trusting a prophecy of what was to come.
Right. He had to trust God to draw life from a biologically dead womb in the form of his son, Isaac. But today, the believer's faith looks back at a fulfilled historical fact.
We are not waiting in suspense for the promise to be executed.
No. Our faith rests in the completion of the promise, which, according to Paul, is the historical reality of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And quoting the commentators, there's a profound point here. Christ's death and resurrection are not two separate events. They are a single, inseparable, redemptive act.
Break down how the two halves of that act connect to the double ledger we discussed earlier.
Okay, so according to the text, Jesus was delivered over to death because our specific sins and moral failures were placed on him. He absorbed the negative side of the ledger. He took the penalty that justice demanded.
Right.
But the resurrection is the divine receipt. The fact that Christ was raised from the dead is the ultimate historical guarantee that the sacrifice was accepted by the court of heaven for our justification.
Wow. So if the resurrection never happened, the ledger would still be unbalanced. The debt would not be cleared?
Exactly. Paul argues elsewhere that if Christ is not raised, human faith is entirely futile and we remain in our guilt. He was raised for our justification. The resurrection proves that the transaction of grace cleared the bank, so to speak, and that this alien righteousness is now fully funded and available to be credited to the account of anyone who believes.
It is the ultimate leveling of the human playing field. It completely destroys the concept of the religious or moral resume.
It really does.
No one can walk into the room and boast about their achievements, and simultaneously, no one is too far gone to receive the credit. The self-righteous person who has spent 50 years volunteering and the spectacular failure who just ruined their life are entirely dependent on the exact same external alien righteousness.
It just removes human ego from the equation entirely. When you realize the ledger is settled outside of yourself, you stop trying to manufacture your own worth.
Which leaves us with a truly fascinating historical and personal thought to consider as we wrap up this deep dive. If Paul's system of unearned grace completely removes the need for humans to build behavioral resumes to prove their worth to God or the universe, it makes sense why this exact text, Romans 4, was the spark that ignited the Protestant Reformation 1,500 years later.
Oh, totally. It dismantled the entire medieval power structure that was built on selling people the merits they thought they needed to earn heaven.
But think about what that means for you personally tomorrow morning. If true righteousness is something entirely alien and external to us, if we truly possess a flawless standing before God that we didn't earn, how should completely abandoning our deep-seated human need to earn our worth fundamentally change the way we live our daily lives?
Yeah, that's the real question.
What happens to your anxiety, your fear of failure, and your desperate need to prove yourself to the people around you when you realize that the highest court in the universe has already declared your ledger perfectly balanced? What happens when a human being finally stops trying to earn their own worth?
It changes everything.
It really does. Thank you for joining us as we unpack this incredible text today. We are saying goodbye for now, and remember, God blesses all the listeners. See you next time.